Hello, everybody, and thanks for coming to my channel. This is the Hungry Math Professor here, and today we're going to be discussing this memoir called My Own Words, which is a memoir about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, written by Mary Hartnett and Wendy Williams. This was a fun book for me to read. I read this actually several years ago when I was a assistant professor at West Point on a visiting three-year position. And while I was there, I had the pleasure of being a part of this book club that ran once a year. And one of the years we read this memoir. And one of the things that made that really special is in this group was myself as well as some other people. But what made it special was that there was a few history professors and a few law professors present in the group that gave us, an even deeper insight into this, the special law and history aspects of what comes up in this memoir about Ruth Bader Ginsburg's life. And the other special thing about it was this event, this book club culminated in, I still have this actually in the book, in this event where Ruth Bader Ginsburg came to West Point and she was interviewed by the dean of West Point at the time, and I got to see her in person, in this big auditorium and hear her speak for a while, being interviewed, which was really a cool experience. This was, back in 2018 when she was still alive. So the memoir was written in 2016. So again, it was before she passed. RBG lived from 1933 to 2020. She was a Supreme Court justice from 1993 to 2020. She was appointed by Bill Clinton, and at the time, she was considered a moderate consensus builder. And she was actually the second woman to be appointed to the Supreme Court. The first woman was Sandra Day O'Connor, who was seen as a moderate conservative swing vote at the time and served from 1981 to 2006. And Sandra Day O'Connor was appointed by Ronald Reagan. And one thing I just wanted to comment on right off the bat about, when these Supreme Court justices are appointed, they often come with some sense of who they're going to be on the court. Right, left, or moderate, or consensus build. These different kinds of descriptions. And one thing that I learned while reading this memoir and being part of this um, book discussion, well, I learned a lot about the Supreme Court. Honestly, at that point in my life, I don't think I knew very much about the Supreme Court. I had not taken much time to study it or think about it as an institution or the culture. And one thing that's interesting is that these Supreme Court justices, of course, they're human beings, they're intellectuals, so they evolve as people, as intellectuals, as uh, 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 justices over the course of their lives, but they also evolve in the sense of relative to the rest of the court. So this in particular affected RBG. Of course, in the first few years as a Supreme Court justice, you're trying to like feel out your place in the court in general and feel out what's going on. But then relative to where the other justices are, you might be able to be more moderate. So I think in the beginning she was pretty moderate, but then when the court kind of shifted right during her tenure there, she became more of what we know of her today as this kind of like more liberal firebrand dissenting opinion, the way that she had to be towards the end of her career. And again, so she, of course, evolves as a person, but she also has to evolve relative to the court based on like where the rest of the court is, right? If there's a big liberal majority, then maybe you can be more moderate in the middle. But if you're in the minority, then you have to make that minority voice heard, right? So anyway, the court evolves and changes over time, and that means that the justices have to evolve and change and adjust over time as well. And of course, a big part of RBG's life and career is centered around gender equality cases and her movement to um, right the wrongs in the U.S. law around gender equality. So we'll talk quite a bit about that in various different points in this discussion. I just wanted to bring it up at the beginning because, in particular, when she went to law school, she started at Harvard. She was one of nine women in a class of 500. So, of course, so that's a huge imbalance. This was in 1956. She winds up transferring to Columbia. There's an interesting story there that I won't go into here. And she ends her career in 1959 to Columbia, and a similar ratio there of women to men. at the time. And now if you look up the statistic, on average, there's more than 50% of incoming classes of law schools are women. I think this is a testament to RBG's vision and her what she did in the course of her life as a lawyer, as a professor, and as a Supreme Court justice. That now, at least the percentage of women that go to law school is more than 50%. An interesting note to make when we're studying RBG's life. But as I mentioned, before I get into some of the specific cases and things that come up in this memoir, um, I also just want to mention that I'll link to there's a CNN documentary on Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and then there's a movie that's also on Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I would recommend all three of these things: the memoir, the documentary, and the movie. If you're looking for the most bang for your buck because you don't want to spend the time reading this entire memoir, then the CNN documentary is the most bang for your buck as far as like how much information you're going to get in a short amount of time. So I'd highly recommend that. The movie is, of course, a dramatization, mostly focusing on her early life. And I think the first case that she argued in front of the Supreme Court is how the movie ends. And then the memoir is going to get you the most details out of those three options. And then, of course, there's other books out there, many other books on RBG that I have not read. So if you want to make a recommendation to me of one of your favorites, I would love to hear that and give it a shot, and then maybe even make a discussion video about it at some point. So again, one of the things that I really enjoyed about reading this memoir and taking part in this book discussion was just how much I learned about the Supreme Court. And I just want to be careful. I'm just going to give you what I learned at the time, and not necessarily exactly what the memoir is about. You can read it and tell me what you think it's about. But this is what was going on in my life at the time, and the impression that it made on me, and how it changed my view of things. And in particular, by reading this memoir, I really became impressed by the institution of the Supreme Court. The way that RBG talks about it really sort of impressed upon me just how impressive the Supreme Court is as an institution. And it really impressed upon me just how it is the sort of the least political branch of the government, as opposed to the House and the Senate, and which is part of the legislative branch, and the president, which is part of the executive branch. The judicial branch, in many ways, is the least political. I just want to make a little caveat here, because when I say that, I know people are going to maybe get frustrated with that comment. But remember, you have to distinguish the appointment process when you appoint a Supreme Court justice to the Supreme Court. That actually tends to be a very political process. But that again is because it involves the Senate and it involves the president, and which are highly political institutions. And so I'm not referring here to the appointment of Supreme Court justices. That is a very political process, a very contentious process. But that's also because there's just so much weight to those appointments. There's so much impact to those appointments. So that all that comes together at one, moment in time, and it creates a very political, very raucous environment around um, appointing these Supreme Court justices. But after their appointments, now they're a part of this very stable institution because they're appointed for life. Again, look at my video on the Federalist Papers, and check out some of the Federalist Papers where they talk about lifetime appointments versus other versions of appointments. But one of the advantages of lifetime appointments is that these justices don't have to worry about going up for reelection. If you think about what makes things so political for senators and representatives, it's the fact that they need to go up for election. Now, I'm not arguing against that. That's an important part of the process, but it also it brings in this maybe necessary evil of just over politicizing things because you have to get elected all the time, and in particular for the House of Representatives, where you have to be elected every 2 years, and the entire House is elected all at once. It makes it the most raucous and political of all the branches of government. But the Supreme Court, because they have lifetime appointments, Ruth Bader Ginsburg in this memoir, and the writers really describe the Supreme Court almost as like this academic institution, right? It's these 9 justices. These are extremely intelligent people, very knowledgeable about the law. And it's like they're meeting and discussing and going into these sort of intellectual arguments together. And it just gave me this very congenial sense of what this institution is all about. And a particular story that is told early on in the memoir, which is really interesting about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, is that she has this really close friendship with Justice Antonin Scalia. Part of what makes that interesting, Antonin Scalia lived from 1936 to 2016, and he was a justice from 1986 to 2016. And he's known for being extremely conservative and representing the originalist and textualist points of view on the Constitution, right? So all these different Supreme Court justices have different philosophies on how you should read the U.S. Constitution and apply it in law, right? And that's very important if you're going to be a Supreme Court justice to have a philosophy on that. And Scalia represents, a very conservative point of view that basically you need to go back to how the founding people who wrote the U.S. Constitution were thinking at the time, what was the political realities, and you have to kind of reconstruct that in your mind in order to understand what the law intends. Which, you should oppose that to the point of view of like judicial activism, where we see the Constitution as more of a living document that should evolve with the country, right? And that's going to be closer to where Ruth Bader Ginsburg is going to find herself. But again, the reason why I bring up Justice Scalia here and why I think she brings it up is just to point to, even though Justice Scalia and Ruth Bader Ginsburg almost never see eye to eye on any cases, very rarely. They're very opposite ends of the spectrum as far as how they interpret the law. They're still friends at the end of the day. And that to me represents an important example, especially to the political reality we find ourselves in now, where it seems like it's very difficult for us to be friends with people on who have very different views than us. I think Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Antonin Scalia are such a beautiful example of what we might be able to do as a country, or what we should maybe shoot for and be leading ourselves towards, is to be able to have that kind of friendship with people that we disagree with. But I think, one thing that's important here is I think they really had a deep respect for each other. They might disagree on the philosophy, but they have a respect for each other's intelligence and each other's abilities as a justice. And so you can't have friendship with somebody you disagree with that much if you don't respect them, right? You have to have respect for that person. And one of the interesting things about their friendship is they both really enjoyed the opera. And so they would go to the opera together at various different times. They would vacation together. There's some interesting pictures you can look up of them vacationing together, having a good time. And they actually were a part of an opera together. They had some lines and things, which is kind of interesting. Um, so I really like this example as just two important people in U.S. politics who were able to be friends across, very different political lines. And again, I think that's just to me, it's a testament to what the Supreme Court is as an institution, as a culture, and what it should be. Of course, I know these things evolve over time, and the Supreme Court makeup evolves over time. But I think this is a good example to meditate on and reflect on as a possible um, ideal that we can try to emulate going forward and lead ourselves to. But of course, in talking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her memoir, it's important to emphasize just how intelligent this person was, and to me, just how impressive she was as a tactician, as an arguer. As a lawyer, you have to persuade other people via arguments, right? You can't just give up and say, oh, that person's stupid or they have a stupid point of view. That's not going to work as a lawyer. You have to meet the people where they are and try to convince them that your point of view is correct. So it's very pragmatic in that point of view, right? And Ruth Bader Ginsburg finds herself in a point in time where gender equality is so far out of whack in the US, and she's ripe and ready to do something about it. But of course, the difficulty is a lot of these courts are made up of almost all men, right? And so somehow she has to come up with ways to argue to these men that these gender inequalities are wrong and that they're not good for the country and that we need to change these things, right? And again, she's also fighting against the tide of history, like these inequality, the gender inequalities have been a part of the U.S. Constitution and culture for a long period of time. So she has to fight against, the just the sheer fact that it's been that way for a while, right? And those are difficult things to fight against when it comes to human beings. We tend to favor the way things always have been, right? And we tend to not want to change things. But again, what I was so impressed with when I was studying Ruth Bader Ginsburg during this time was just her ability to be persuasive, to come up with really good strategies for how to make these justices see the problem that was so apparent from her point of view, right? She could have easily went into these courtrooms with just really strong arguments from our modern points of view that we would probably agree with, but she would never win a case that way, right? And again, I just think she's so intelligent to be able to craft a case, look for the right cases to bring up, and in order to convince these men who are on the courts to change the rules for to make it better for women, but also just to make it better for the country. And one of the ways that she does that is she purposely finds some cases that actually involve gender equality for men. Again, what a great strategy. It's not that she thinks she needs to like help men out so much in the country. That's not why she's doing that. It's just she wants to help women out predominantly because that's where the inequality is. But she understands that if she can make the argument that there's gender inequality for a man, that will be a more persuasive argument to the particular people who are on the court. And at the end of the day, that will have the pragmatic goal of helping women. So it's just like this really um, good understanding of what the end goal is. And just I just see her as such a great leader in understanding how to get things done in a pragmatic way, which is so necessary when it comes to trying to change government, right? It requires a pragmatic point of view. It requires a lot of reasoning and logic, but you have to understand how to compromise and how to incrementally get what you want from the government and change the law. And she was so good at that, right? So I'm going to highlight some cases, though there's many more in this memoir that you can look at, and there's so many that RBG was involved in. But I'm just going to highlight a few cases which point to this strategy. And so the first case that she argues in front of the Supreme Court, so this is when she was a law professor and, of course, a practicing lawyer. She argues this case, Frontiero versus Richardson, in front of the Supreme Court. And the point here is that it's an argument about benefits that are given out by the U.S. military. And the point is that those benefits should not be different based on gender. So it's a very, very, I think from a modern point of view, this is like clear, a gender inequality case that should be changed, right? But we have to remember that at the time, it's not how people saw things. And so the point is that, you should be giving out these military benefits to the spouses of these military professionals, regardless of the gender of their spouse. But the part of the genius here is she found a lieutenant in the Air Force who was a woman at the time, and this woman, Sharon Frontiero, was applying for benefits for her husband. And so the injustice in the particular case is that her husband's not able to get the same benefits that he would get if he was a woman. And also, it points to the fact that for whatever reason, Sharon Frontiero's status in the military doesn't count for the same as it would if she was a man, right? So again, it's just this important realization that if RBG can find a case like that, she can start to make incremental progress towards gender equality in front of these courts that are 100% men at the time. So I'll let you look into more details about that. And the movie that I'll link to in particular um, has to do with this the two cases I'm talking about now. So the second case was her second case that Ruth Bader Ginsburg argued in front of the court in 1975 was Weinberger versus Weisenfeld. And again, this was about Social Security benefits for sole survivors. And again, she found a case where there was a couple, a husband and wife, and the wife just had a more consistent, better paying job over a period of time, and then she suddenly died and left her husband with their kid that was still alive, and he had to take more time off of work, so he wasn't making much money, and he wasn't getting much Social Security benefits, and this was a clear injustice, a gender equality justice, because again, why did this wife was paying into the Social Security system, and if she was a man, her then her spouse would get a lot more money from Social Security benefits. But because she's a woman, somehow her contributions don't count the same. Why does that make sense? And also, because her spouse is a man who's taking care of their kid now, he doesn't get as much money. Like, that doesn't make any sense. He's still in a really difficult situation. He still needs that money to take care of their kid. And again, it's just this really good strategy to find these cases as a way of trying to chip away at gender inequality issues. And those are just the first two cases. There's many more cases after that point to um, RBG's legacy at improving gender inequality in the U.S. under the law in particular. And another case that I want to point to. So now this case comes up while Ruth Bader Ginsburg is a part of the Supreme Court, and it has to do with the Virginia Military Institute becoming co-ed in 1997. So this case was really important because, again, remember, I was at West Point, so they really focused on certain cases that had the most to do with the military. So this just should be noted historically that West Point became co-ed in 1976. West Point is one of the service academies that focuses on branching to the Army, and the Naval Academy to the Navy, and the Air Force Academy to the Air Force, as you might expect. But Virginia Military Institute is a public senior military college in Lexington, Virginia, and they're the people who graduate from VMI wind up branching into all three branches. But they're not as I understand, they're not as closely tied to the U.S. government when it comes to their appointments as like West Point, the Naval Academy, and the Air Force are. So they became co-ed much later in 1997, and the case came before the Supreme Court while RBG was one of the Supreme Court justices, and she wrote the majority opinion when they won that case, and it forced VMI to become co-ed. And so then there was afterwards the first female class of cadets at VMI. So that was a very important case that came up early in RBG's career on the Supreme Court. And then, of course, later in RBG's life, she became, the court shifted to the right. And so she was in the minority, oftentimes on the left. And so she became famous for this sort of master dissenter. She wrote these dissents. When you're on the minority opinion, they call them a dissent. You're opposing the winning opinion. And she was known for just writing these fiery dissents against the right. And again, I'm not so sure that RBG changed all that much. I mean, I think she evolved as a person. Let me not get me wrong here, but I think her attitude and the way she wrote had to change because of the way the court changed, right? And so now she really had to represent the liberal opinion because they were losing, and she still felt that they were right, and that needed to be done in a very strong way. And then towards the end of her life, this is the part that I know the best, because when I was paying attention to politics, she became known as the notorious RBG, and she was like this pop icon, made all kinds of memes about her, and SNL did some things, and it was really kind of funny how she became sort of larger than life in this in culture, in social media and things like that. It's interesting because if you watch some videos on RBG or when I saw her in person, and even if you watch the documentary and things and hear her husband talk about her, outwardly she's this very sort of frail, soft-spoken, tiny person, right? And even as a thinker, she's this very inward, reflective, deep thinker. That's what makes her such a good lawyer. That's what makes her such a Supreme Court justice. But as her personality in general, she's not like the most boisterous. She's not the kind of person that's going to like stand out in a crowd of people talking. She's very much the kind of person who wants to read and think and have intellectual arguments and make strategies to sort of better the world around us. So it's ironic, this sort of the way that she was she got picked up as this pop icon and portrayed as this, this this master dissenter, and it was really fun to be a part of that. As I was living and paying attention to that at the end of her life, and of course she died in 2020 at the age of 87, and she was replaced by another woman, Justice Amy Coney Barrett, um, by Trump. And I'll just end it there. I really recommend this memoir. I really recommend that you just sort of do a study of RBG and use it as a way to understand better the Supreme Court and how the U.S. How it works in the U.S. And also, I just want to encourage you, no matter where you find yourself on the political spectrum, left, right, center, there's something here for you to learn and to change your perspective a little bit. So I really encourage you to take some time to dig in and let me know what you think. Again, if there's some other books on RBG that you think I should read or some other documentaries, I'd love to hear about them. And I'd love to hear your comments. Thanks.